Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I'll start right on time, even though we have still people dropping in. Welcome to today's seminar, and welcome to AI for Good. This seminar is organized by the ITU WHO Focus Group on AI for Health and the Department of Biomedical Informatics at Harvard Medical School. If you're interested in knowing more about what ITU and WHO are doing in this focus group on AI for Health, please reach out anytime. We're always looking for people to join the effort. AI for Good is UN's leading initiative around how AI can help achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. And today I have the privilege of introducing today's session as part of the AI and Health webinar series, Dissecting Algorithmic Bias by Ziad Obermeyer. Ziad trained as an emergency doctor, and he still gets away as often as he can to a hospital in rural Arizona to do what he loves most, work in the ER. But these days, Ziad spends most of his time doing research and teaching at UC Berkeley. Inspired by his clinical work, he builds machine learning algorithms that help doctors make better decisions. He also studies where those algorithms can go wrong and how they can scale up racial bias and how to fix them. He has received numerous awards and published in a wide range of journals and for the work he's done. His work has been highly influential, and he's frequently cited in the public debate about algorithms, as well as federal and state regulatory guidance and civil investigations. Dear audience, please ask away during Ziad's talk using the Q&A functionality. Please ask short questions. That'll be easier for me to handle. And yes, Ziad, please take it away.
Matthias, thank you so much, and thanks for having me as part of this series. Let me get my slides up. And I wanted to maybe start from, even though I'll be talking about a disturbing and very negative topic, I wanted to start with a somewhat optimistic perspective, which reflects how I think about algorithms in healthcare, which is that there are lots of great uses of algorithms in healthcare. A lot of what we do in clinical care, in healthcare policy, is things like risk prediction, trying to figure out what will happen to a patient or a population of patients. Doctors are often faced with diagnostic problems where they need to look at a patient, take in all of the information about that patient they have, and form a probability estimate about the likelihood a patient will have a disease. And all of those things are wonderful uses for algorithms where I think they can really help us make better decisions. But at the same time, there are many ways that along that path, algorithms might go wrong. And in particular, there are a lot of very reasonable concerns that those algorithms can reproduce and even scale up the racial biases in our society and in our data sets. So that's what I'm going to talk about today. And what I thought I'd do is walk through two concrete case studies. The first one is an algorithm that we studied that scales up racial bias. And this was built into a piece of commercial software that in the US at least affected the medical decisions for tens of millions of people. And so that's maybe the pessimistic side of the talk, the evil twin. But there's a good twin, and that's the second case study. And this is an algorithm that fights against racial bias. And this is a bias that's built into the DNA of medical knowledge that I don't think anyone was really aware of until we used an algorithm to try to unpack it and discover it. Along the way, I'll just highlight some common themes where I think applied work is very useful. One is highlighting how pointing algorithms towards the right target variables is a critical but often underlooked part of building algorithms and assessing their effectiveness. And the second is trying to highlight also some of the applied work that some colleagues and I are doing to try to fix the underlying problems that lead to both bias and the research that has failed to uncover it so far. So let me start with the evil twin and tell you a little bit about the setting in which this algorithm is used. So in the US, but all around the world, when you're in the position of a healthcare system planner, you know that you've got a population of patients, and some of those patients are ticking time bombs. They look okay today, but they are going to get sick. And those patients will go on to have both poor health outcomes, but also high costs. And so in the US, and I think in parallel around the world, what most healthcare systems have invested in is what's called care management or high-risk care management. It's trying to find patients that we can help today with interventions like getting them on the right medications, detecting infections early before they spread, arranging for prompt primary care, so that we nip those problems in the bud and catch them before they turn into exacerbations of chronic conditions, and poor health outcomes for the patient, and also high healthcare costs for the healthcare system. The problem is that those programs are expensive. So it's usually a team of trained providers, often nurses, that are just on call for a population of patients. So it's like a VIP program for very needy patients where there's a low threshold to call. There's a telephone line where you get a human. The human will actually come and help you at your house if you need it. They'll refill your medications. They'll arrange for a primary care appointment. All of those things cost money. And we can't do all of those things for everyone because of limited resources for health. So we need to target those interventions to the people who need them the most. And that's, of course, where algorithms come in. So I'll tell you about a piece of commercial software that we studied that by the developers' estimates was being used to make decisions for 70 million people every year in just the US. If you step back and look at the market of algorithms that work just like this one, they're being used for effectively the majority of the US population for similar decisions. So the scale of these algorithms in health is already at an enormous point that I think I didn't realize before I started studying this topic. What all of these algorithms do is what I discussed earlier. They try to find patients who are going to get sick so that we can help them with their health needs today. So what they do is something that algorithms are very good at. They are trying to predict the future. So they take all of the data that we have available on a patient today, and they look in a year from now who's going to get sick as measured by the healthcare costs that that person generates from things like ER visits and inpatient hospitalizations and all of these things that we hope we might be able to prevent by targeting them with help today. So all seems very reasonable and seems like a great use case for algorithms. I'll just give you one more layer of detail on how these things work in practice. So if you think about the algorithm, the way it was used at the healthcare system where we studied it, and as we've seen in a lot of replication work since, a very common use is the algorithm is run a few times a year. And so this is run on a population of patients, like a primary care patient population or a set of insured patients, and it generates a risk score for every patient. And the patient doesn't need to come into the hospital or to the clinic. The patient can just be sitting on their couch, and the algorithm generates a risk score. And those risk scores are in a distribution where there's like tails. And the top 2%, that right tail, is essentially automatically enrolled into the high-risk care management program. So this is the high priority group. They get fast-tracked into the program. The top half, approximately, apart from those people, are shown to their doctor. So the doctor gets a list of patients who are in this range, along with some other data about each of those patients. And the doctor gets the opportunity to say, yes, this person would benefit from the program, this person doesn't need it, et cetera. So this is a human in the loop, but it's being presented with a list of patients that's curated by the algorithm. And then that bottom 55% effectively just gets screened out and is not considered for extra help in this way. So in a very concrete sense, the algorithm score determines how someone is treated. Now, for a variety of reasons, we were interested in whether these algorithms were biased. And to define any kind of bias, whether it's racial bias, gender bias, anything else, you actually need to come up with a crisp definition of what bias would look like empirically in your data set. And so here's how we defined it. What we stated was that people with the same score are treated the same. So that's what I just showed you. If you have a score in a given range, you're either prioritized for high-risk care management, you're shown to your doctor for consideration, or you're screened out and not considered at all. So if people with the same score are treated the same for the purposes of helping them with their healthcare needs, then those needs should also be the same. And in particular, the color of their skin should not matter. But that's not what we found. And so this is effectively our paper from 2 years ago in one graph. And I'll just walk you through the axes of the graph. So on the x-axis down here, we have taken the algorithm risk score And we've put people into percentile bins from the lowest percentile over here at 0 to the highest risk people at 100. And this vertical line here is showing you where the threshold is for the high priority group. So everyone to the right of that gets fast-tracked into the program. On the y-axis here, I'm showing you one measure of health. And we looked at a lot of different measures of health to try to get at someone's health needs over the year after the algorithm made its prediction about whether they needed help or not. This is a measure of whether someone had a chronic condition that flared up. So if you had to go see your doctor for congestive heart failure or for emphysema or anything else, or you went to the ER, you got a +1 on that score. And we just totaled up all of those things over the year following the algorithm's prediction as a measure of that person's healthcare needs. And then what the graph is showing is Black patients and white patients' healthcare needs relative to their score. And what you can see is that no matter where we are on that x-axis, the Black patients are above the white patients. So this purple line here is above the gold line. And what that means is that at any given score, if you took two patients, one Black and one white, on average, the Black patient will go on to have higher health needs than the white patient, no matter where we are in that score distribution. So how much bias does this create? It's not immediately obvious from this graph. So let me give you a couple of numbers. So if we look at that high priority group, this is that top 2 or 3% to the right of that line that get prioritized for the program. When we studied this high priority group, according to how the algorithm was working, we found that it was 18% Black. Now, you might be reassured by that because the population from which this high-risk group was drawn was only 12% Black. So you could look at this number and be reassured that, oh, the algorithm is overrepresenting Black patients in this group. And so how could it be biased? The problem is if you draw this horizontal line across here, you can see that the marginal white patient is much healthier than the marginal Black patient. And that the marginal Black patient, if we were treating people the same based on their health needs, is over here if you're Black and here if you're white. So if we simulate what an unbiased algorithm would look like, you would find that that high priority group should be almost half Black, not 18% Black. So this was a very large degree of bias that was being injected into the decision-making about who gets help and who doesn't. And it was effectively letting healthier white patients cut in line ahead of sicker Black patients as they were considered for extra help. So the title of the talk is Dissecting Bias. And so we want to figure out where the bias is coming from and where the algorithm is going wrong. It turns out that a very good place to start understanding that is where the algorithm is going right. So now I'm showing you a different graph. It's still the algorithm score from low risk to high risk on the x-axis, but now on the y-axis, I'm showing you not someone's healthcare needs, but someone's healthcare costs over the year after the algorithm made its prediction. And what you can see is that the algorithm is doing a very good job of predicting costs. This is actually, sorry, the scale is quite small, but this is a log scale. So the algorithm is doing very well for predicting someone's healthcare costs. And it's doing so almost as well for Black and white patients. Those lines are right on top of each other and they're not separated like the health line was. So what does that mean? Well, it means that the algorithm is biased for predicting health needs, but unbiased for predicting costs. Why is that and how could that be? Well, there's only one explanation for this, just algebraically. It's that Black and white patients don't have the same relationship between their health status and their health costs. Why is that? Well, for two main categories of reasons. One is that white patients just have better access to healthcare. And that's a statement about poverty, about transportation, about family support, about being able to take a day off of work to go get your scheduled biopsy when a doctor is concerned about cancer. So for all of those reasons, because being Black is correlated with being poor and being socioeconomically disadvantaged, white patients are going to have better access to healthcare and thus higher costs at a given level of health. But in the US, there's also another set of factors, which is that the healthcare system just treats Black patients differently. And so there are many studies that show that, if you take two patients with the same vignette about their cardiovascular risk factors, for example, and you just swap a picture accompanying the vignette of a white patient versus a Black patient, cardiologists are far less likely to recommend that patient for advanced testing for coronary artery disease. So there is just this racism that's built into the healthcare system that has the same effect. It means that costs are lower, conditional on health. And that's not just a statement about race or something about the US's uniquely unequal healthcare system, because in the population that we studied, all of these patients were insured. They had either good private insurance or they had government Medicare insurance, which is comparable to the health insurance schemes that most European countries have. So even within this insured population, there were still these barriers to access and discrimination against certain kinds of patients that led their costs to be lower, conditional on their needs. So when you train an algorithm to accurately predict cost, which is exactly what this algorithm is doing, you're also training it to be biased when it predicts its health needs. So we took away a few lessons for algorithmic audits, and these are lessons that we've taken with us to a lot of other settings where we've deployed similar algorithms. So the first one is that articulating this ideal target for the algorithm to be predicting is extremely important. So we understood how this algorithm was being used in the setting of the healthcare system. It's being used to help make a really important decision about who's going to get sick so that we can help them with their healthcare needs today. Now, that crisp statement of what an algorithm should be doing is unfortunately often an afterthought after we've put all of the data together and merged it and done all of the hard data work. It's very tempting to just predict a misleading and biased proxy like cost. Cost isn't an unreasonable thing to predict here because sick people do generate a lot of healthcare costs. And that happens for both Black and white patients. The problem is that it's a biased proxy for someone's health needs. So when we articulate that ideal target for the algorithm grounded in how the algorithm is being used in the real world, we've also articulated the goalposts for holding that algorithm accountable. Now, we measured how the algorithm was predicting someone's healthcare needs relative to their score. And that is going to detect all sorts of biases. So I showed you that it detects what we're calling label choice bias. This is the choice, sorry for the spelling error, the choice to predict a biased proxy instead of the true underlying quantity of interest, the choice to predict healthcare costs instead of healthcare needs. But it's also going to detect all sorts of other biases. The bias that's caused by failure to generalize from one population to another, for example, as we've seen with pulse oximetry measurements. So articulating that ideal target is a fundamental part of holding an algorithm accountable for good prediction and prediction across lots of different groups. A corollary of this is that we should not get distracted by some of the potentially misleading metrics of bias that are often cited in the literature. So had we simply looked at the ability of the algorithm to predict someone's healthcare cost, as I showed you on that graph, we would have been misled into thinking that this algorithm was unbiased. The algorithm is predicting cost very well for both Black patients and white patients. Had we just looked at calibration or its accuracy for predicting cost, we would have missed the very large degree of bias for predicting the thing that it was actually supposed to be predicting, which was health needs, not health costs. Likewise, had we just looked at the fraction of Black patients in that high priority group, 18% versus 12%, we might have concluded that, oh, relative to random sampling or to the base rate, we're actually doing well. The algorithm is prioritizing Black patients, but it wasn't prioritizing them nearly enough. And finally, there's a lot of attention to whether there's an explicit correction for race in algorithms. In this algorithm that we studied, there was explicitly no correction for race because the people who made the algorithm were actually very worried that that would introduce racial bias. The absence of that explicit race correction did not prevent this algorithm from being very biased. And likewise, the presence of a race correction does not guarantee that an algorithm is biased. It is much more about, is the algorithm predicting the right thing than what is it using to predict the thing that it's predicting. And so I think that there are lots of ways that you can be misled when you're quantifying bias in an algorithm. And I think the fundamental insight that I've learned, at least from this work, is that articulating that ideal target is the key and everything else is secondary. Finally, to end on a somewhat more optimistic note, I think that detecting bias in the way that we did and in follow-up work that we're currently doing is often the roadmap for fixing those biases. So we actually, before we published this work, we got in touch with the company that made the algorithm that we were studying. And we essentially just told them, look, we found this problem that you might want to know about. And they were very motivated to work with us. And we collaborated on a pro bono basis with their technical teams to retrain an algorithm to predict health instead of healthcare costs. And doing that on one measure of bias led to an 84% reduction in the degree of racial bias that algorithm was scaling up in this population. So once you've articulated the ideal target for an algorithm, then you know what the algorithm should be predicting, and then you can go train that algorithm instead of the one that was biased to begin with. And I'll just point out that that algorithm goes from the biased version, that is reproducing all of the injustices and inequalities in our healthcare system, to a tool that fundamentally redistributes resources. It gets resources to people who need those resources. So it's turned from a tool that perpetuates injustice into a tool that actually fights against those injustices. And I think that's a really positive message that we learned. I wanted to mention one document that we've produced, which comes out of collaborating with dozens of organizations in healthcare over the past couple of years. So we took advantage of some of the attention that we got from this initial work to initiate collaborations with health insurers, healthcare systems, even technology companies in the US, and essentially audit and try to debias those algorithms that they were using in everyday practice. And I think the bad news is that we found bias almost everywhere we looked in the course of those collaborations. So in similar settings to the one that we initially studied for making decisions about who gets what in a population of patients, whether it's high-risk care management or primary care slots or anything like that, a lot of algorithms were predicting things similar to costs rather than things similar to true healthcare needs. But it wasn't just that. It was in algorithms that are supposed to be predicting the onset of disease, so predicting the onset of diabetes. But we don't know someone's true diabetes status. We only know whether they're diagnosed with diabetes by a healthcare system that doesn't have equal access for everybody. So we're often missing data on the people we care about the most, which means that the algorithms that are predicting those diagnoses are just predicting access to healthcare and reallocating resources from the people who already have resources to give them more resources, rather than getting those resources to people who are undiagnosed that we really want to find with algorithms. There are many operational decisions in the clinic that have a similar structure. So one thing that many healthcare systems in the US and outside of the US are doing is trying to figure out, okay, I've got a schedule of patients that are supposed to show up today in my clinic. Who's not going to show up so that I can rebook their appointment to someone who will show up? Not an unreasonable thing to do. But again, there are several reasons why someone might not show up to a clinic appointment. One is because they didn't feel like it. Their knee pain went away. Their runny nose got better. Another is they didn't have access to the means of transportation or getting the day off of work to go into that visit. And that latter category, you'd want to treat very, very differently from the category of patients that just decided not to show up. You want to go help those patients. The last thing you want to do is rebook their slot to someone who's going to show up. So that's the bad news. The good news, though, is that almost all of those biases that we found are fixable. And once we articulate the ideal target, what the algorithm is supposed to be doing, we're able to retrain an algorithm that predicts that thing rather than the biased proxy that it was originally predicting. And I wanted to mention this, this document that we produced where we tried to distill all of the lessons that we learned from these collaborations into very concrete steps that organizations could take to reduce bias in the algorithms that they're already using, as well as trying to prevent bias from emerging in algorithms later on. So let me just go back to the graph and answer a question in the chat from Lilia. Thanks for asking. So if you look at the marginal patient, and let me define what I mean by the marginal patient. So everyone to the right of this line is going to get prioritized for access to the high-risk care management program that helps them with their health. So if I look right at this decision threshold, the white patient average is here, which means that they have about 3.5 exacerbations of chronic conditions. The marginal Black patient is at 5 chronic conditions over that next year. And so if I had the same standard for Black patients as I do for white patients, I would have 3.5 chronic condition Black patients getting into the program. And so what we did to figure out how many Black patients should be in the program is we just simulated, had we just had the same threshold for everyone and treated patients the same based on their health needs, not the color of their skin, how many Black patients would we have ended up with in that high priority group? And that's the 47%. So you can imagine just drawing a horizontal line somewhere in between the white and the Black patients based on the weighted average of how many patients there are in each group. And if you draw that line treating people equally on health, you would end up with a high priority group that's half Black, not 18% Black. So that's what I mean by the marginal patient. So let me keep going here. And Sandra, thanks for asking. Maybe we can come back to that. It's a great question for the discussion. So I think the ITU team is going to post a link to this playbook in the chat, but we've also been pursuing new collaborations. And so if you're working in health, but also in other industries like finance or criminal justice, and you're interested in pursuing either an algorithmic audit or understanding the accountability structures that your organization might want to put in place to prevent bias going forward, please get in touch with us. Our contact information is going to be on that website that the ITU team will link in the chat. I'll just give a preview of some of those measures here, which is that many organizations don't really have a structure for oversight of algorithms. And that oversight is a huge strategic priority for organizations, even bigger than just bias. Because in any organization that's using algorithms, the whole point of algorithms is to affect decision-making at scale, to affect thousands or tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of customers, patients, defendants, et cetera, at once. So if there's no oversight for these tremendously important and large-scale tools, there's no way to know if they're doing the right thing. And that is an issue for bias, but it's just an issue for, are your algorithms behaving the way you want them to? And that position needs to be at the executive level of an organization. It can't just be pushed down to lower levels of people who are responsible for information technology alone, because those people don't have the ability to close the loop and fit these algorithms into strategic priorities as well as bias reduction at the management level. So that responsibility really needs to be at a high level of organizations. Another thing we found is that most organizations actually don't know what algorithms are in use and touching their customers and patients at any time. And that's a huge problem for that oversight function. It's also a problem because we don't know how the algorithms are performing. So in many other industries, organizations are required to keep very careful documentation on how algorithms are performing, how they're treating different kinds of people. And that documentation standard is completely absent in this area of algorithmic performance and bias. And so keeping careful documentation of each algorithm based on the inventory, what decision is that algorithm affecting? What is the ideal target for that algorithm? And how is the algorithm performing both overall and for groups that are potentially disadvantaged? Those kinds of details are really important because they let you fix or delete algorithms that are biased, but they also let your algorithm be prepared for the inevitable investigations into algorithmic bias and other aspects of performance that are coming down the road in the US and elsewhere in the world as regulators get more and more concerned about bias. And from my work with law enforcement agencies in the US, as well as federal regulators, I know that this is going to be a very high priority over the next few decades. So let me switch gears and go into the maybe more positive story about how algorithms can fight against racial biases. And to switch settings completely, let me change the frame and tell you a little bit about pain. So pain is very widespread in society, but it's also very unequally distributed. And when we look at the distribution of pain by income, by race, by education, you find that poor, non-white, low-income people just have a lot more pain. And to give you a sense of scale, there are surveys that ask people, for example, have you been in severe pain in the past couple of days? And in the US, white patients, about 5% of them report severe pain over the past 2 or 3 days, whereas Black and other non-white patients reported at twice that rate. So 10, 12% are in severe pain at any given time. So these disparities are huge. And I think, when I first read about these, like everyone else, perhaps my mind went to an obvious explanation, which is that, many illnesses that cause pain are just more common in those populations. So we're going to be using as our running example arthritis in the knee. And if you just look at the distribution of knee pain, maybe it's all just explained by the fact that Black patients have more arthritis in their knee. But the story is not that simple, because what the literature can do in that setting is adjust for that difference in the prevalence of these painful conditions. And so for knee arthritis, we can actually condition on the way someone's x-ray looks. So we can take 2 patients who have a similar degree of arthritis in their knee and repeat this exercise and ask them, how much pain are you in? And what that literature has found is that disadvantaged patients, non-white patients, low income, low education patients, still have more pain. So even when we've held the appearance of the x-ray constant, they still report more pain at any level of severity of that x-ray. And so that's, I think, a mystery in the literature. So, there's this pain gap between Black and white patients, for example, that we can't explain with the objective features of the knee x-ray. And so how has the literature dealt with this? Well, I think very reasonably what the literature has said is it's not in their knees. We've conditioned on the appearance of the x-ray, and that's not where the pain is coming from. And so if it's not in their knees, where is it? Well, maybe it's in the patient's heads. And this, I don't mean this in a pejorative sense at all, because there's a lot of good research that shows, for example, that patients under more stress, as these disadvantaged patients often are, report that the same physical stimulus is more painful in the setting of stress. There's a lot of literature on how anxiety and depression can often manifest as pain, and those things are more prevalent. Because of all of the other burdens on people's lives, there could be less bandwidth for coping with pain, leading to higher pain reports. Or alternatively, the medical system could be treating these patients differently. They could be managing pain differently because of discrimination built into access or pain management. But notice that all of these explanations have something in common, which is that the source of that difference in pain is not in the knee. It's somewhere else. It's in society. It's in the medical system. It's in psychiatric or psychosomatic factors. So just to make this very concrete, if you're a doctor and you have a patient that comes in with pain in her knee, you might send that patient for an x-ray to judge, for example, the presence of arthritis and other painful conditions. And the implication of this literature is that if that patient is Black or low income or low education, the radiologist is more likely to come back and say, well, the x-ray looks fine, and I'm not finding an explanation for this pain in the patient's x-ray. And that's going to lead you as the doctor to pursue these other paths for trying to explain and manage the pain. So you might refer the patient to a therapist or a psychiatrist rather than referring them to an orthopedist or to a physical therapist for the knee. You're going to pursue these other lines of diagnosis and treatment. Everything I've told you so far depends very critically on what we mean by the severity of disease in the knee or the appearance of arthritis, the degree of arthritis on the x-ray. Everything I've said conditions on some measure of severity. So I've taken 2 patients who have the same severity of disease in their knee, and Black patients have more pain, for example. But how do we measure the degree of severity of arthritis in someone's knee? Well, let me show you the medical state of the art for measuring that. It's this. It's a radiologist looking at an x-ray and judging on all of these different compartments of the knee and location, the degree of arthritis, for example, that's affecting this patient's knee. And so when we think about that, what I thought of was, well, maybe those doctors are missing something when it comes to the knees of Black patients. And so, how are they doing it? Well, there's actually these objective grading scales that, might make that less likely. The most common scale is developed by these two gentlemen, Drs. Kellgren and Dr. Lawrence, based on studies in the 1940s and 50s, leading to the Kellgren-Lawrence grade. And those studies were done on coal miners in Lancashire, in England. And when you go back to those original studies, you find no mention of the subject's race or sex, because all of the coal miners at that time were white and male, and that's how we learned about arthritis. So that might reinforce your suspicion that the radiologist could be missing something when they're looking at those knee x-rays and judging objective severity of the knee arthritis. So the corollary to that is like, well, if humans are missing this problem potentially, that they're not seeing things in the knee that might be causing pain in Black patients, maybe an algorithm could do better. And so, the algorithm could find things that the human radiologist is overlooking. The algorithm, though, would suffer from a critical problem if we applied the standard machine learning playbook to train the algorithm. Because the typical playbook, as shown in these studies and many others, is to take the X-ray image and take what the radiologist said about that image and train the algorithm to replicate what the radiologist would say about that knee. So if we're worried that humans are missing something on that knee, this is exactly what we don't want to do. We don't want the algorithm to just tell us what a human would say. We want the algorithm to find something new, but how do we do that? So again, like our cost versus health prediction target for the algorithm in the previous example, what we did here is find a better target for prediction. So what the standard playbook would do is to learn from the radiologist. So input the X-ray image and output the Kellgren-Lawrence grade, for example, that a radiologist would assign to that knee. But it turns out that, there's another human that you could ask about the knee, whose opinion is at least as important as the radiologist, and that's the patient. And that's what we did. So rather than training the algorithm to predict what the radiologist would say about the knee, we trained the algorithm to listen to the patient and predict what the patient would say about the degree of pain in their knee. And I'll just note that finding data to do this exercise was not at all straightforward. It's very easy to find data sets that pair an X-ray to what a radiologist said. That's sitting on every hospital system's radiology data management system. It's much, much harder to find X-rays paired with what the patient said about the body part in question. And that, I think generally reflects the fact that our healthcare system cares a lot more about what doctors say than about what patients say. But we were lucky enough to find a data set that had exactly this. So a diverse sample of patients with X-rays linked to pain scores. And once we have those data, it's a very straightforward machine learning problem where we take all of the images, we train a pretty standard convolutional neural net, and we predict the amount of pain that someone has in that knee. And if the algorithm can predict the degree of pain in someone's knee with just the pixels describing the knee and nothing else about the patient, that pain is correlated to something that's in the knee, not in their heads, not based on what side of the bed they woke up on. I think a lot of people view pain scores as very noisy and subjective. If they were very noisy and subjective, we couldn't correlate them to anything in the knee. This algorithm would do no better than chance. And that's not at all what we found. So let me tell you the main finding of this study. The first fact to tell you is that if we just compare Black and white patients in our study setting, we find the same gaps in pain that we find everywhere else. And so on this scale, no pain is 100 and severe pain is less than 86. It's a little counterintuitive. The pain gap between Black and white patients is 11 points. So that's more than halfway between no pain and severe pain. So Black patients are in much more pain. If we take into account what the radiologist says, the Kellgren-Lawrence grade of the image, we can actually account for part of that gap. So part of that gap is due to the fact that Black patients have worse arthritis, but not much of that gap. If we compare patients taking into account severity according to the algorithm, though, instead of the radiologist, we can account for almost half of that gap. And so a lot of this mysterious, unexplained pain gap that we went looking for sources in patients' heads or in other places, it's actually in the knee. It's just something that radiologists are not currently seeing. And we see similar results for low-income patients and low-education patients, although less pronounced. So there are many explanations that we tried to rule out in the paper. And one I'll just mention in particular is you might worry that the algorithm is just reconstructing race. So we know that Black patients are in more pain. So if the algorithm could just read off who's Black and who's white from the X-ray, it could reconstruct that, Black patients are in more pain, and it would have nothing to do with the sources of pain in the X-ray. It would just be, well, this patient is Black or this patient is white. And that's not the case here, because we can actually control for race directly, and doing so doesn't at all change the algorithm's explanatory power for pain. So whatever the algorithm is seeing, it's statistically nearly independent from race. And so you can't just write it all off as, oh, the algorithm is just a race detector, and we're just reproducing the fact that different races report different levels of pain. It's not artifact. We can cross-validate across study sites. It's not even better weighting of what radiologists are already seeing. We can't explain the algorithm score by just looking at the radiologist features. So the algorithm genuinely seems to be finding new signal for pain in this X-ray that has nothing to do with race or BMI or anything else, and has little to do with what radiologists are already seeing in the knee. Why is this so important? Well, go back to the clinic. When you see a patient in severe pain whose X-ray looks normal, you won't refer them to an orthopedist. If you see someone in severe pain whose X-ray looks very abnormal and has a lot of arthritis, you're going to refer them to orthopedics, and that orthopedist is going to consider putting in a knee replacement. And so that is really important, because we see big disparities in the degree of access to knee replacement by race. And what we were wondering is, could this disparity in just grading the X-rays be part of what's going on here? So we did a very simple simulation experiment here, which is that we took patients with severe pain, and we first looked at, okay, who are the ones who are eligible for surgery based on criteria that are used in the clinic, but also for insurance decisions in the US, and who's eligible just based on the radiologist's reading of severity. So to be eligible, you have to have high pain, but also high degrees of arthritis, according to the radiologist. But now we're going to swap in, rather than the radiologist's severity measure, the algorithm severity measure. And we're going to figure out, how does that change who's eligible for surgery? And doing that would double the fraction of Black patients' knees that are eligible for surgery. So this is, again, a huge bias that is now built into medical knowledge that an algorithm is able to see and potentially undo. And we're doing a lot of follow-up work on this to try to figure out what's going on, and should we be thinking about different ways to allocate diagnoses and surgeries as a function of this. So stepping back, some of the lessons that I took away from that work. What we want algorithms to do for us in medicine and in health is we want them to do better than humans. We don't just want algorithms that reproduce what radiologists know and have known for decades, but might be biased because it's grounded in a particular population at a particular time. We don't just want algorithms to reproduce our own errors and biases. We want them to do better. But to do that, algorithms need to learn from nature. They need to learn from outcomes, from patient experiences and illnesses, not just from radiologists. But that data is sorely lacking in our healthcare system, not because it's lacking in general, but because it's so siloed and locked into the particular healthcare systems where it lives. And that means that we don't have a matching function where the people who have a great idea to look at these kinds of problems in medicine can get access to data, because there's no way to get the data out or to get those researchers in without doing 2 or 3 years of work on legal agreements and research protocols. So I wanted to mention another applied project that I've been working on. It's a nonprofit organization called Nightingale Open Science that I co-founded with one of my collaborators. And the goal is to make these kinds of data available at no charge to researchers. So we work with healthcare systems, with government agencies and health agencies around the world to build up exactly these kinds of data sets that pair images with ground truth outcomes. Around mortality, around illness development, around pain, and things like that. And we work with those systems. We invest a lot of money to build up the data infrastructure as well as the data sets. And in exchange, we get a de-identified version that is compliant with HIPAA in the US and compliant with GDPR in the EU. And we put that on our cloud and we make it available to researchers under a nonprofit research data use agreement. And the goal in 3 words is basically ImageNet for medicine. So ImageNet was a fundamental resource that pushed forward machine vision and computer science. And we're trying to build that for medicine, but around big medical problems and around data sets with ground truth outcomes, not just human interpretations. And we've been, fairly successful with donors that view medicine as this technological backwater where we're insulated from all of the exciting developments that have transformed other fields. And so Schmidt Futures and the Moore Foundation and some other tech-forward donors have been very interested in this. And that's what gives us money to invest in working with healthcare systems to build up these kinds of data sets. We're launching that publicly at NeurIPS, which is one of the big computer sciences conferences this December. But please get in touch. We're going to post the link to that and we can get access to researchers early who are, friends and family, which I consider all of you. So let me close by saying that both in the example of an algorithm that predicted costs instead of health, and in this example of an algorithm that uncovered bias by predicting pain instead of the radiologist opinion, getting the right target for algorithms to predict, choosing the right label is fundamental. It's a major source of bias in healthcare algorithms, but also in other fields. So in criminal justice, we often want to predict someone's criminality, but we don't have a variable called criminality. We have variables like arrests or convictions, and those are very different. So this is a huge problem in many, many different fields, but it's one that we can actually study in health. And I think health provides this amazing opportunity to learn about algorithms more broadly and to build algorithms that truly benefit people, grounded in this deep knowledge of both the health problems that we're trying to solve and the data science methods that we can use to solve them. And so I think that having researchers, as I imagine all of you to be, bilingual in 2 fields, it doesn't have to be health, but any kind of content area where you're deeply engaged in decision-making and you understand how algorithms are being used and how they should be used, as well as understanding how those algorithms are built and how to evaluate them. I think that kind of bilingual nature of these fields is in very high demand and getting higher. And I think in medicine, at least, that will be the basis of a new scientific field. So let me end there and happy to use the last few minutes for questions.
Thank you so much, Ziad. That was absolutely brilliant. And I love your perspective on a new scientific field at the intersection. And I think I totally agree. And it's always, when we talk to Zach at the, DBMI, and it's, always this mantra of medicine as a sort of data processing discipline. And we just haven't been really good at making data work for patients. So I was just in the hospital today and I wanted to kick off discussions with this thought. So much what you do as a physician is based not on the outcome of interest, but on surrogate markers. So if you want to treat a patient with an antibiotic, ideally the outcome would be, is the patient getting better? But the outcome the surrogate you're actually choosing your antibiotic is it being killed in the lab, in the microbiology lab? So would you think that now, as what you've just described, the process of looking at the right label, is that something where every medical field will go through, evaluating when, what are we treating really? Is it the final outcome or is it just a lab result?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think I don't mean to minimize the challenges of finding those right labels. It's not like it's so obvious. So if you think about even what we did in that first example, I don't think we broke any new ground. We were essentially using an index of comorbidities and stitching them all together. But we also looked at blood pressure because we had biomarkers from electronic health record data. We looked at hemoglobin A1C. We looked at kidney function. We looked at lots of other things. Now, that presents a ton of problems because not everybody has a hemoglobin A1C. Not everybody. So I think these things are really hard. And I think that, you often do need to triangulate because we have a lot of proxies that all tell us slightly different things. We have mortality that tells us, an ultimate measure of interest, but lots of things cause mortality, not just, did the person get treated with antibiotics? So I think that really speaks to that need for people who are very steeped in that clinical practice and understand, okay, this proxy gives me this, but it doesn't give me this. But this proxy I can use to give me that other thing. And so by triangulating and by using your knowledge as someone who spent time in the hospital, you understand the data generating process much better than anyone else. That's the kind of knowledge that you need to build into this finding the right labels. And I'll just mention one other thing, which is that we often in this data science world consider the data sets to be fixed. And we just say, well, these are the measures we have. But we're in a health system. The health system collects a ton of data all the time. So why aren't we investing more in actually going out and collecting more data? When we do a randomized trial, think of the enormous investment in data collection that they make to get the right outcomes for their trial. Why aren't we doing that with algorithms? Because we're kind of lazy and we don't want to spend money on this and we just want to get the data set and run something. But this is a really important topic and it needs to be resourced appropriately too.
Yeah. Great, thank you. I'd like to ask a question on behalf of Tobias Heimann. He's asking, what's the added value of an algorithm predicting pain from an X-ray? Couldn't you just ask the patient and get the same results?
Great question. So let me just distinguish between two things. So when the patient reports pain, the patient's report could be coming from the knee, but it could also be coming from all of these other channels. It could be coming from stress. It could be coming from, there is a lot of noise, so when people say, oh, these pain scores, it's just a random number generator. It's like what you had for lunch plus which side of the bed you woke up on plus, something else. There's a lot of truth to that. So if you were to draw a graph where the patient's pain report was one node, you have a ton of things pointing to that in addition to the knee. But now think of what we're doing. What we're saying is we're giving the algorithm just the pixels in the knee, and we're asking the algorithm to now predict what the patient is going to say. So what the algorithm is doing is we're not actually trying to replicate the pain score. In fact, we don't want to replicate the pain score because the pain score has all of these other influences. We're getting the pain score attributable to, because it's predictable from, the knee X-ray. And I think that's the value. So we actually, if you just looked at the algorithm performance from a pure loss minimization point of view, the last thing you'd want to do is to have zero loss. We don't want all these other things. We just want the part of the pain score that's coming from the knee.
Yeah, okay. Daniela Oliveira is asking about how to make technical informaticians work together with clinicians. How do you get, sometimes they don't speak the same language. How do you get to work them together?
Yeah, thanks, Matthias, for bringing up the language point. I think that's a really fundamental one because I do think that when you look at most people's model of collaboration in this area, it's like, well, I'm just going to put a doctor together with a computer scientist in a room, and then they're going to do great stuff. But if you've ever listened to a conversation between a doctor and a computer scientist in a room, you would update very negatively on the ability of those two people to produce great stuff, because as you said, they don't speak the same language. And so I think that this model of mixing and matching and just, you shake up the cube and then see what happens is absolutely the wrong one for collaboration. The grain of truth is there, which is that you need many disciplines, but the computer scientist actually needs to spend a lot of time thinking about health or criminal justice or whatever field she's trying to work in. And, the bad news for the doctors is that you actually need to learn some math. And so, I think I came out of medical school knowing less math than I knew when I went into medical school. And I think that is just a huge problem with medical education. How is it possible that in medicine we have no statistics requirement? for getting into medical school. It is insane. Everyone agrees that, oh, data is the future of medicine, but where is the pipeline producing people that are going to build that future? Medical schools are like stuck in the scientific curriculum of 100 years ago, and it is a huge problem. So I'm actually very pessimistic from that point of view about the pipeline. And what I'm trying to do is I teach an undergraduate class at Berkeley because I've given up on medical schools doing this function, and I think that's a big problem. So I'm just trying to get people early, and I hope that I can like teach them enough math plus medicine before they ever get to medical school, so that even when medical school just degrades their mathematical and statistical capacities over like 4 to 7 years of med school and residency, they'll still have enough at the end to actually do good work. But it's a big problem.
Alex Morrison is interested whether you broke down or stratified both of your studies by other folks of African descent, Africa versus Americans, and so forth.
Yeah, we would have liked to. I think, unfortunately, as is sadly often the case, especially as you start being interested in intersectionality and sort of like how these categories work together, your cell sizes just get very small, and it just gets harder to do good statistical comparisons. And so the largest groups that we were able to look at were simply kind of like self-reported Black versus other, low income, low education versus other, because our sample size was only a few thousand people. So unfortunately, we weren't able to look at other groups in the knee pain exercise. If you look at the supplement in the first paper, the science paper on health versus costs, we have a couple of other groups in the supplement that we were able to break down. But the standard errors just get very big, and it's hard to kind of make any firm conclusions.
Okay, yeah. So I wanted to talk a little bit about how do you envision what is your thinking about regulating algorithms, like after people have taken your playbook and discovered bias and maybe fixed it. Do you envision something like a bug bounty program? Like, I don't know, Microsoft and Google has it. If you discover a bug, you go like confidentially to them and fix it, and then I don't know, you get rewarded.
I love that. I love that idea. I think that's fantastic, and I think that would be one of many incentive systems we should put in place for finding this. I think that one of the reasons, though, that we haven't had a lot of work on this so far is because there are just so many definitions of bias. And as we've learned, they can't all be simultaneously satisfied. And so I think there's just this confusion in the field on, if you're a regulator, what am I regulating? Like, what's the target for regulation? And I think if you think about the parallel to drugs, with drugs, randomized trials are like not straightforward. Like statistically, that this is like, but regulators know how to use that, and they know how to say, okay, when I'm regulating a drug and deciding whether to approve a drug, it needs to do more good than harm. And the way I do that is with a randomized trial. So with algorithms, we haven't yet had that same kind of goalpost. But I think that one of the things we've learned from our work is that articulating that ideal target, like what is the piece of information that this algorithm should be providing to a decision maker to help them influence a decision, in a particular decision at a particular time, I think that's the target for regulation. And so once we have the target for regulation, then I think a lot of the bug bounty is a great idea. Investigations can know what to ask for and what to measure empirically. Agencies can issue guidance for industry in particular settings and things like that. But until we can agree on what the target for regulation is, then we don't know what to incentivize, what to investigate, what to guide. And so I think that's maybe like the building block that's missing right now. But I think we're understanding that better and better.
Yeah, I'd like to give Frank the last question. He's asking, how do you think algorithmic diagnoses could play together with clinicians' diagnoses? If it's known the algorithm is better than the clinician, would you as a patient still have the choice what diagnosis you take?
So I think that it'll never be a choice. And the reason goes back to, Matthias, your point that there's never one thing that a doctor looks at, even to make a diagnosis. So we think of like when we think, oh, we need to diagnose heart attack. How do we write down heart attack? Well, it's the electrocardiogram plus the troponin plus how the patient does plus what happens when you catheterize them. And so algorithms can predict those individual things. And I think that predicting those things will really help the doctor to make the diagnosis. But there's always going to be stuff that's missing from what the algorithm can predict. And that's what the doctor is going to do. And so I think that like that's, when people talk in vague terms about like, oh, it's not about automation, it's about augmentation, this is what they mean. Yeah. There's always stuff that's going to be missing from your data set. The algorithm is going to do a great job predicting the stuff that's in your data set, but there's always going to be stuff that the doctor also needs to take into account. So I view the algorithm output as an input to the doctor, not a substitute for the doctor.
Cool, thank you. So Ziad, we're at the hour. I really love your talk. I think we could go on for much longer discussing all these important aspects of medicine, society, algorithms at large. But I think now is a good time to maybe have a small poll and ask all our participants if you like this talk and if you would recommend this AI and health series further. And we're really trying to have speakers like Ziad who work at these topics which are so important right now, where we discover that things we've done in medicine, like like the estimated GFR or other metrics that just have so much bias built in them. And that like now is really an exciting time where we can improve on that. And I think this was such a cool example. So thanks again, Ziad, for joining us today. Thanks to all our participants.
Wait, Matthias, I'm not allowed to vote. This is very unfair. I
may be biased.
So to give myself a 10. This is outrageous.
And so thank you everyone for tuning in today. And to those who watched on YouTube or the Twitter live stream, maybe next time come to the Zoom webinar, because then you can ask questions too. And I wish you all a great day, a good night, and hope to see you next time.
Thank you.
Thanks.